So now we will start with our last panel. After that, we will have a two books discussion. I'm very glad to see here Oksana Myshlovska from the University of Bern. She will talk about regional differences in redefining the meaning of the past and providing meaning to the ongoing tragic events in Ukraine, the case of Novohrad-Volynskyi. Then we will have Viktoria Sereda with the topic on In Search of Belonging, Rethinking the Other and the Historical Memory of Ukrainian IDPs. And then Rimante from the University of Bologna, Post-Yugoslav Cinema, Overcoming Methodological Nationalism. And then Cécile, Druey and Hess, they're here. And they will speak about Minsk processes, societal perception and narratives. Discussant, Oksana, you're here, okay, great. So we have all participants. Oksana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for the introduction. Can you help me to put on the presentation?
Sure.
So, and then to scroll, I just scroll.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the acknowledgement of the overall project within which the paper I'm presenting today makes part of a larger project, and I'm happy to have also my colleagues from the project on this panel. As a general introduction to this small city of 50,000 citizens, which I will be talking about today, I would like to start with a broader framing of my paper by looking at the turning moment during the Euromaidan. And these turning moments are related to violence. So the first big turning moment was the 30th of November, then was the first beating of students when violence was used. The second moment during the turning moment during the Euromaidan, that was the end of January after the adoption of the so-called dictatorial laws, and when there were the first dead on the Euromaidan. And the third turning point, then the most violence, the biggest escalation took place. This is from the 18th to the 20th of February. My paper looks at the interpretation and the meaning that is attributed to violence. And the first, just to frame this overall, my larger interest in framing of violence, I just wanted to show you how the regional and actor differentiated framing of violence, how much it was kind of the picture, the overall picture of Ukraine during this period. So if we look, I'm using just one example, the end of January 2014, just to show you as an example, there were statements on each of these turning points. There were statements by almost across regions, by various regional local council, like what is the interpretation, what is happening in Ukraine, and there was also statements by different actors, what it means to them, what is happening at the Euromaidan. And what we see here as an example, there has been very different regional framing and attitude to these turning moments at the Euromaidan. As the opposition, the three oppositional parties, they put out a statement on 22nd of January 2014, where they attributed violence of what was happening in January totally to the law enforcement and to the state, blaming Yanukovych and Zakharchenko. Then if we look at other regions of Ukraine, there was very different attribution of violence. Here, just using the example of Crimea, where the Verkhovna Rada of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea put out the statement where they attributed fully all responsibility for the bloody events in the capital with the leaders of the opposition and organizers of the Maidan and their accomplices. It's also very interesting, this still remains not addressed topic in research. It's also very interesting to see in regions where there were huge debates and negotiation on the final statement and attitude to violence during the Euromaidan, and kind of as in Luhansk and Donetsk, which councils which were fully controlled by the Party of Regions, the local council, they just adopted the statements which were proposed by the Party of Regions. In other regions of Ukraine, there were heated debate between the opposition, mostly Batkivshchina, and on the one side, and the Party of Region on the other side, on how to interpret violence. Today I will present a case which is based in between these extremes of what was happening in Western Ukraine, opposition interpretation of violence, and what kind of this also different interpretation in Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, where violence attributed just to one actor. I am taking as my case study, being kind of inspired by Kaliva's study of violence during the Greek Civil War, just seeing how different locations and even villages which are next to each other, how interpretation of and the development of violence, how they can differ from one location to another. So I'm just taking as an example of the small city of Novohrad-Volynskyi in Zhytomyrska Oblast. And what I'm interested in, first I'm looking at the local level, how the interpretation of violence, and not looking at this major national cleavages and interpretation of violence, but also the local actors, that there has been negotiation and different attitudes to violence also at the local level, and different actors competing in defining what it means, what means these turning events during the Euromaidan, and then later providing framework meaning to this, what means the Euromaidan, what means the ongoing conflict. The second, I'm using this cognitive dimension, as our project is kind of the core topic of our project is focused on history and memory. So I'm also looking at this cognitive dimension and the use of history and memory in kind of framing of violence and attitudes to these turning moments. And I'm also using a micro level approach. As I said, I'm just focusing on a small city, trying to understand the local dynamics, but also I'm doing organizational actor analysis, where I'm selecting one organization, Bratstvo UNOPA, and just showing how a previously marginal organization, how it gets social legitimacy at the local level in interpreting ongoing events, and also kind of influencing the local mnemonic landscape and providing meaning to the ongoing events. The part which I will not be presenting today, but which is also important part of my research, this is the role of civil society organizations which were challenging these far-right group interpretation, nationalist interpretation of events. And that was my initial motivation to go to the city, because I found kind of one scholar who has been questioning nationalist narrative, which has been very unusual. I have interviewed him and see how this one person has been challenging this narrative. But also very importantly, I look at this local level initiatives by women, the Association of Mothers and Wives of Servicemen, which has emerged as a peace-building actor who have challenged this dominant narrative, which has been promoted by far-right organization, and which also have taken a position arguing that there cannot be violence, violence cannot be legitimized, and pushing the government to negotiate with the other side and resolve the conflict in a peaceful manner. In terms of methods, I was in Novohrad-Volynskyi in July 2019, where I conducted interviews with both government, local government representative and civil society representatives, including Bratstvo UNOPA. And also I have the whole archive of local press, where I'm looking how this framing, how it evolves over the time in the local press, and how different actors, how they frame kind of different framing of violence. And also I'm identifying the moment when dominant narratives, interpretation of the Euromaidan, how they emerge, and then how they are accepted at the local level as dominant meanings. In terms of theoretical framework, doing a lot of drawing on a lot of literatures, where we started in our project 7 minutes, okay, half. We started in our project by starting from classical memory literature, but then I saw that it was not enough for me to explain kind of just analyzing discourses, it was not enough for me to, as a tools for analysis at the local level. So I have delved in a number of research fields, a number of literatures coming from conflict studies, and also looking at cognitive dimension of radicalization, which is kind of also includes history and memory as a part of cognitive radicalization. So I looked first at this radicalization literature, which looks at the role of violence as a transformative moment, and especially like work of De La Porta, who looks how violence, starting from small scale, how it evolves in the interaction between the government, social movements, and how violence radicalizes identities, groups, and how it evolves over the time. I've mentioned already cognitive dimension here. I'm also borrowing a lot also from framing, like Zofia mentioned in kind of one type of use of framing lenses, but there is also very established literature in social movements, literature on framing, and I'm basing myself on that, where history and memory is already integrated into kind of these frameworks of meaning and analysis of social movements and radicalization. Then I'm taking a relational approach, which is also coming from social movements and radicalization literature, which does not look at actors as set with set identities, but looks at how identities change in relation of groups in relation to each other, and also in relation to the changing framework conditions. So I also found this as a tool very interesting to study this dynamism of claim making and dynamism of identities. Also, another big development in conflict studies has been kind of deconstruction of groups, and this comes like both from sociologists like Brubaker at looking at organizations as a disaggregated level of analysis instead of groups, which are kind of the main level of analysis for conflict studies. We said groups with the famous book Horowitz, Groups in Conflict, where now it has been one of the developments in conflict studies to disaggregate the level of analysis to organizations and look at this competition in meaning making and in radicalization. And finally, also I'm drawing on Bartal and kind of this more classical socio-psychological foundation of conflict literature, which, however, I find it's not sufficient because it just looks at beliefs which are disembedded from their political framework. So I'm starting mapping of a small city of 50,000. I'm starting before the kind of the slow pace of Euromaidan in November, December. I'm just looking what different organizations were doing during this period. And one sees that already one of the organizations, like local self-government bodies, would be almost neutral without any statements on the Euromaidan, where in the city there will be nothing organized on during the Euromaidan protest in Kiev. But there will be one statement by the Organization of Veterans of Ukraine, who will very clearly come with a very clear interpretation and which was published in the local newspaper, what it means, the Euromaidan. And for them, it was very clearly associated with the competition of oppositional parties to capture power, and also they were very critical about the use of violence, which they attributed to the opposition. Then very interesting, it's the behavior of other actors which were supportive of Euromaidan at the local level. And the first small Euromaidan of 100 people, which was organized at the local level, it was very clearly organized by Batkivshchina and Svoboda parties, where you can see that they convened this small gathering, and also there is party symbolic where you see on the photos both Batkivshchina and Svoboda as kind of this first Euromaidan meeting. And Bratstvo UNUPA, which was a very small organization before the Euromaidan, like at 3 people, like almost without kind of big impact at the local level. They organized a participation, about 50 participants from the city to Kiev Maidan, and the head of this organization, he said, I'm responsible for bringing the boys back alive. So it really was kind of a main organizing actor for local participation in the Euromaidan. The next part of my paper is about analysis when there are these transformational moments in the Euromaidan. I'm looking at what was the position of the local council and also of other actors in attitudes to violence during the end of January and then the end of February. And the local council was very clearly stood out from the interpretation of violence by the opposition in Western Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, Southern Ukraine, where they put out all of their statements were dialogue about all, and there cannot be legitimization of violence and attribution of violence to both sides. And this is a statement they put out all the time, just saying that violence is applied by both sides, both by the opposition and by the government. And they say they repeat the same statement several times, but then on the 22nd of February, there is a transformational, after the shooting of protesters, there is a transformational moment at the local level where the state fully loses legitimacy also at the local level. And the government, the local self-government, which is dominated neither by Party of Regions nor by the opposition, but by Volodymyr Litvin's party, they felt captured between the opposition and Party of Regions, that kind of they suffered that both competition between the two parties, that they felt that we are losing as a local self-governance body, we are losing legitimacy as well, together with a full loss of state legitimacy. This is very interesting moment which I identify. The time is up. I identify especially when this Bratstvo UNOPA, how it gains legitimacy at the local level, which is related to this full loss of state legitimacy at the local level, where local law enforcement, there are statements of non-confidence to the local courts, law enforcement bodies, to procuracy, but mostly also, most importantly, the mayor, who does not belong to the Party of Regions, so it's also the vote of non-confidence to the Party of Regions, but he feels that he loses legitimacy, and himself, he organizes the bottom of confidence in the local council to kind of regain trust of the local community as a kind of representative of the local state, local self-governance. So that kind of means that was much broader kind of loss of state legitimacy, not only linked to the law enforcement bodies, Party of Region, but much broader. Also, during this moment, we see that there are the alternative law enforcement bodies which are organized by Bratstvo UNOPA, who start to organize local self-defense units by legitimizing this, that Titushki will come to Novohrad-Volynskyi, but it's also very clearly that there is an opposition which is participating, but Batькivщина Svoboda and Bratstvo UNOPA in organizing these first self-defense units. Also, what they start to do, they organize the military training camps for the youth already, kind of as a body parallel to kind of the state that they start to organize, and they say that if you want to have, it's the end of February 2014, where they say if you want peace, you need to prepare for war. So already they kind of driving this agenda at the local level. Then the next part of my paper is linked to, and I will end there, like one part is about interpretation of violence, and then the very important moment when Euromaidan, kind of the dominant interpretation which gets accepted at the local level. And the other part of my paper, I'm just looking at very quick transformational changes in mnemonic landscape at the local level, and all of this is led by Bratstvo UNOPA. That is kind of the base on which the Lenin, as a compromise in 2013, kind of the removal of the monument to Lenin to the local park of Slava, when there is a monument to fighters for freedom of Ukraine, which is put on the same base, and again at the initiatives of Party Svoboda and Bratstvo UNOPA. But very importantly, there was local discussion in the local council about the meaning to attribute to this new monument which is built. But then Bratstvo UNUPA, kind of all of the new introduction in mnemonic reinterpretation, they had to, all of these new monuments reinterpretation to be accepted by the local council, but very often what appeared in reality, they have added words and interpretation which were not adopted by the council. So for example, here they attached a new plate to the monument to Holodomor, where they have the UN trident, which they added without permission, which was not voted by the local council, and also they added the word Moscow Stalinist totalitarian regime, which is also was not accepted by the council. And there are many other things, like here I just show all of the initiatives, how like plaques to Konovalit and this arch that they built, and also this kind of also involved in Bratstvo UNUPA, providing much wider meaning what it means, the military deaths. I'm ending here. Military deaths and the meaning of the conflict, ongoing conflict at the local level.
So I'm very sorry for
yes, conclusions. So for that, I think in my research, I would like to underline that this regional dimension of what was happening still remains very much underexplored, and that's also in the next papers I plan to study, like this regional dimension, especially attitude to violence. And also I'm building on the literature, which looks how this interpretation of violence, how much it is central to rebuilding identities and overall to structuring identities. Then the second issue, also I'm looking how there is much broader societal legitimization of previously marginal groups. So I'm looking also how this happens and what are the local mechanisms at the local level, how these interpretation, how there is much wider acceptance of this new interpretation. Also, there is a very important development, it's the legitimization of the Organization of Veterans of Ukraine and Communist Party of Ukraine, which before they were kind of opposing the nationalist interpretation, and this happens much ahead before the decommunization laws at the local level, in the local discussions in the local council, toponymical commission, where these previously kind of important and socially important groups, how they are kind of sidelined in the discussion. And the last part of my research, as I said, this will be my next step, where I will be exploring the role of the civil society organization contesting these interpretations, and also the role of women organization as promoting peaceful resolution of the conflict and questioning this dominant meaning of conflict, which has been attributed at the local level, but also at the national, with the interaction between national and local levels.
Oksana, thank you very much. Nice. So now we are going to switch to Victoria. Victoria?
Yes.
Are you here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. The floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm just finished my 20 hours long transatlantic flight, so I'm slightly jet lagged, and I guess it might influence my performance. But today I'll be talking about the search of belonging and historical memory within the group, which is very important for contemporary Ukrainian society, which are Ukrainian and IDPs. And I thank you, Oksana, because she already gave us some glimpse and created certain framework telling us what's happening on the local level in the localities, with rethinking of historical memory and attitudes to the past. And here we are adding one more dimension. We have a new influx of people, a new group which are coming from other regions into those local communities, and it creates another level of complication. So I started with the Peter Gatrell's work on refugees, because I thought there are certain similarities. He was focusing on refugees during the First World War, And he shows how refugee, an absolutely new category which appeared, created by war, suddenly became one of the most important social categories and factor of identity for millions of people. And I guess we are facing very similar situation in Ukraine today, when we have more than 2 million, close to 2 million people who either left Ukraine to the other countries, or who are officially registered as internally displaced people within the country. But when we are talking about identity, we have several approaches. The first one says that whenever we have a new group, or we have a group, we have certain mechanisms when the in-group is trying to emphasize differences between itself and other groups, and diminish differences within the group, which creates a situation of opposition, we and us, they, creating automatically certain tensions. So if we would use this approach, of course, we immediately would be looking as a sociologist at other any tensions, and what are those tensions between this new group of Ukrainian IDPs and receiving communities. But I prefer to work with the new approaches of everyday nationalism, where they question possibility of such unifying approach to the group, and they are trying to look more to the how this identities are created as a separate units without certain clear bodies, how they are renegotiated within certain groups. And of course, if we are taking Ukrainian IDPs, we are immediately creating a very simplified approach and a very simplified group, because here we would lump people coming both from different destinations, from different settlements with very different social and national backgrounds. And here, I guess, much more productive would be if we, instead of using identity term, we will use a term of belonging. And for me, belonging much better conveys the relationship between individuals and society, first of all, and also allows us to analyze interaction not only within the groups or in between different groups and individuals, but also to look at spaces and cultures. And in this case, for me, very important is the dimension of time, temporal allocation of belonging. So when our internally displaced people are rethinking or re-articulating their belonging, but do they use or see themselves in terms of present, or do they use certain elements of past? What elements of past are used? And here I applied the theoretical approach by Vanessa May. She already tried to study British society using a belonging framework and looking for the temporal dimensions of belonging. And she suggested that we have 3 different types of temporal dimensions inbuilt into belonging narratives. One is temporal dislocation, and this one is typically associated with the transition to older age. So I'm much less interested in this particular type, and I am in my study was more interested in the 2 other temporal dimension of displacement, when people are lost in past, and for them it's very important that they make a connection to a particular place. So when they are talking about past, they mostly anchor themselves to a particular localities or places. And temporal migration, when people again anchor talking or developing their belonging, they anchor themselves to particular periods in past, and or they are using certain historical figures, markers, to build their belonging. So for me, this was very interesting to look at the narratives of IDPs, both from Crimea and Donbass, and try to look at these two types of temporal dimensions of belonging. First of all, how and whether they are talking about different types of localities. Do we have this type of temporal dimension present in their narratives? And in the second part of my paper, I'm looking at the temporal dimension. So I'm looking more at what types of historical narratives are used, which periods are the most important for them when they are developing or rethinking their belonging at the places where they found themselves in between 2014 and 2017. Methodologically, I'm driving on more than 200 interviews, which we're conducting all over Ukraine, including government and non-government controlled territories of Donbass, as well as in neighboring countries such as Russia, Germany, and Poland, where part of Ukrainians were resettling after the beginning of the conflict. So if we look at the spatial temporal displacement dimensions, we immediately see that, of course, this is very natural and logical, that the presence of nostalgia about the place that is left is present in almost every narratives, because all of them left their houses, left their places. But if we step beyond that narrative, we see that IDPs from Donbass often show a lack of articulated interest in the local history of their own cities or regions where they came from. And they also demonstrate a narrative of their belonging, very weak attachment to the regional identity. So the narrative of being from Donbass or having specific Donbass attachment to certain specific local spaces or places or region is absent in their narratives. Instead, what we see much more distinguishing marker of belonging, which is extremely important for them, and this is belonging to the urban civilization. Sometimes also to the Soviet ethos of mining, which was cultivated in their family narratives. In contrast, if we look into Crimean IDPs interviews, we see very strong sense of attachment to the region and to the local symbolic landscapes, which are really becoming a key elements of their narrative of belonging. And we see how local and ethnic forms create a core of how they narrate their belonging, how it's structured, and they're constantly reiterating or coming back and structuring their stories along this local spaces they left and which are important for them, and they are still narrating their attachments through this local space and regional space. Another very important dimension present in Crimean Tatars interviews is not only local and regional attachment, but also, I would say, transnational attachment to the Black Sea symbolic spaces and regions. So here we see how two groups of respondents in very different ways develop the narratives of belonging to the certain localities. At the same time, what we see, what is common for both groups is that internally displaced persons from both regions emphasize that quite often when they came to and resettled in new communities, they often felt lost in their host locations. Depending on the region of resettlement, they were also feeling a general loss of familiar or local social space. which could resonate with their knowledge. And here we have, again, as Oksana presented, a double situation, double trouble, because spaces quite often are not very familiar to them, and we know that actually historical memory, which is present in Ukrainian regions, might be very different on symbolical levels. And here we have also a situation when the decolonization is unfolding and new cult of heroes is building up in different ways in different regions. So they are also entering this phase of debates, which stimulated very actively their rethinking of belonging and their attitudes to the past, both through walking through the cities, visiting museums, attending different excursions, and debates within their family households, trying to understand what is happening both within the country and within these new local spaces they were attending. Talking about temporal migrations, of course, the key event from which they start and around which they build their interviews would be Euromaidan or Revolution of Dignity. But besides of that, what we see that interviews demonstrate that all this above mentioned process of relocation and experiencing new local spaces push them to reimagine also belonging to the past and to rethink symbolic markers, events of historical figures, which are become important source of newly emerging sense of belonging for them. And here we see that these memory wars, which are present in their narratives, would unfold around three narratives: Ukrainian national, Ukrainian Soviet, and imperial. And in this case, we would have both Russian imperial and other imperial narratives present, depending on the region they came to or they came from.
Victoria, so 1 minute left.
Yes, perfect. So for the IDPs from Donbass, temporal location of their belonging is typically belong around the Soviet schemes of past, but what we see, and with the key element, this would be glorification stories about the experience of Second World War. But what we see that they claim, first of all, many new narratives appearing, which were silenced within their families. And these new narratives help them to deal or to build their new narrative of belonging to the communities, such as decolonization, Holodomor narratives, and narratives about, in quotation mark, problematic ethnic origins, such as Greek, Polish, and other, helping them in the process of their resettlement to the new territories and new locations. We also see that within the families, within this new temporal focuses are gradually shifting. And there are many intergenerational discussions about the nature of the Soviet past, with a central figure of also Bandera and UPA, which create tensions. And this is the main marker of othering used within local communities, within IDP communities, but also quite often, especially if we are talking about narratives conducted at the non-controlled Ukrainian government territories, then we see how the whole Ukrainian society and citizens of the society are associated quite often with Bandera image. And this creates again a new lines of disruption between parts of the society and people who are resettling. Finally, if we are talking about Crimean Tatars, their temporal localization of belonging is also Soviet past, but with very different twist. This would be victimization narrative with a central event, which is deportation. And then this victimization narrative will be built around many other very complex historical schemes. So it's very interesting how they are using historical memory within their family stories to pass knowledge and identity and build it structurally again around the local local memory about certain local and regional landmarks. Similarly, within their narratives, you could have the whole history of the Crimean Tatar group beginning from early modern time till today, with the key elements which would be structured along this victimization narrative. And this creates a possibility for them to open up into and build in their belonging either into Ukrainian national narrative, using the same tropes or same schemes of anti-Soviet, pro-Ukrainian elements of the past, or, for example, to build into the wider Black Sea narrative using imperial past they belong to. So, for example...
Thank you, Victoria, but we are out of time. I'm so sorry.
So,
otherwise, we don't have any time for questions and comments.
If for detailed, especially I guess for the sociologists, it's very important to have quotations present. So I attached, and you can in the comments folder, you have a English language translation of my presentation and also Ukrainian language article, which includes not only conclusions or certain positions, but also a lot of quotations from interviews.
So thank you, Victoria, for presenting your fascinating topic. And now we're going to Rimante.
Hello, everyone. I'm trying to share my presentation.
Yeah, it works.
Okay. So I'm Rimante Jaugaite from the University of Bologna, and hopefully I will graduate in a week from my master's studies in interdisciplinary studies on Eastern Europe. So today I decided to present you a part of my master thesis, kind of shifting it more to our topic that is more about new approaches and methodologies. So the presentation topic of today is Post-Yugoslav cinema, overcoming methodological nationalism. And this is a very short plan of my presentation. So first of all, I would see what methodological nationalism is. Then I would check how it is connected with hegemony and the third dimension of power. And finally, I will answer the question why I chose post-Yugoslav cinema. So, well, probably you've already discussed something about it. I'm pretty sure you did, because I didn't follow all the presentations, but just shortly, as we are from like different disciplines here. So, methodological nationalism, according to Wimmer and Schiller, in short, I will quote here, is the assumption that the nation-state society is the natural social and political form of the modern world, end of the quote. So these scholars basically criticize the blindness of social sciences, the blindness to nationalism, and this approach that a nation-state is a sole unit of analysis or as a container of social processes. And moreover, Wimmer and Schiller, they define 3 types of methodological nationalism. So the first type is ignorance of the importance of nationalism for modern societies. And I'll quote here again. social sciences have been closely attached to and shaped by the experience of modern nation-state formation. The social sciences were captured by apparent naturalness and givenness of the world divided into societies along the lines of nation-states. End of the quote. Here is the second type that they define, so that's naturalization. And I'm quoting here again. Typical of more empirically oriented social science practices is taking national discourses, agendas, loyalties, and histories for granted, without problematizing them or making them an object of analysis in its own right. End of the quote. And lastly, the last type is territorial limitation. So confining studies to geopolitical boundaries of a particular nation state. So all of this article was written almost 20 years ago. I feel that it's still so relevant here, especially with all the upheaval of nationalism in Eastern and Central Europe. And here is the other concept that I would like shortly to present or remind for some of you. So it's hegemony and the third dimension of power, presented by scholar Stephen Lukes. So he's talking about the third dimension of power, but before talking about the third dimension, I'll just shortly introduce the first and the second one. So the first dimension is decision-making. It is eliminating an opponent in a fair game election campaign and where all relevant topics can be seen by everyone in the public arena. Then the second dimension is non-decision making. So that's basically the work of the media, where the media serves the dominant elites by talking only about those topics that they deem relevant and neglecting or distorting others. And finally, the third dimension of power, so-called ideological power or hegemony, is about eliminating the relevant topics altogether. So in short, it's basically how certain issues do not get on agenda to be discussed at all. And I was discussing with my amazing supervisor, Anna Devic. So she said that actually in the post-socialist societies, these non-existing problems, are about the millions of people who lost their jobs, the shady privatization of state property, the loss of inexpensive education and healthcare. Because Stephen Lukes, he was writing more about the Western democracies, especially the US. So these are what are relevant for post-socialist societies, Eastern Europe, right? So they rarely get analyzed as prime topics of any political agenda here. And then in post-Yugoslav space, you have all these above mentioned problems, plus you have the war crimes topic that is always out of the agenda. So the war crimes of our side get covered only in the marginal media that are pronounced to be enemies of a nation, right, and paid by foreign governments, and so on. And here now I would like to go to my research, that is post-Yugoslav cinema, or actually the whole topic of my master thesis is non-dealing with war crimes on film, post-Yugoslav cinema as a method of fostering reconciliation and peace. So, I'm trying to answer whether and how the independent cinema in Yugosphere contributes and shapes the current process of reconciliation and peace. But of course, reconciliation and peace building are such a big definitions, that some scholars even doubt that they are possible. So what I'm actually doing in my work, I'm looking at the representation of war of enemy others, as well as how the idea of reconciliation is represented. So I chose 27 films that I'm dealing with, and I'm using the moral landscape method that was introduced by Professor Martin Lehner at the Hiena's Reconciliation Center. So he's writing, actually his article is about Rwanda's genocide and also the films on Rwanda's genocide. And he's creating this method using the theories of Charles Taylor, basically. And he gives 3 approaches. So I'm using 2 of these approaches. One of the approaches, content analysis, with the hermeneutical approach, so it gets a little bit deeper. And I also had 19 long interviews with the cinema makers and 1 film critic. And I'm also considering the theories of aesthetic cognitivism and transnational cinema. So as I'm coming from a historical field, actually this research was a bit challenging because it includes so many elements from different disciplines. Yeah, but I think I really got some interesting insights. So here I will shortly present my conclusions. So what I got is that films do not necessarily manipulate the viewer, but instead may foster a deeper understanding by opening the sensitive subjects on war crimes and traumas. So I'm not trying to say that the cinema would change the world or something like this, but it really may foster a deeper understanding among the people, among understanding so-called the other. And also among understanding some issues that are very that are really important, that are also usually hidden. So what I found common in these films is that, yeah, they do not look for collective guilt parties. They analyze in depth the problems on the level of individuals, not collectives, not like huge groups. Then third, they do not test reconciliation or peace ideas per se. So, they're not funded by, I don't know, NGOs or similar organizations. Then they all talk about humanity by promoting common human values, searching for truth, emphasizing the individuals. And they do not insist on laying blame, but rather calling for the solutions and looking forward to the future. So the filmmakers themselves, they, of course, first of all, they consider themselves as filmmakers, but not only, because they give voices to the victims and illuminate the war crimes. Then they also, in the interviews, I found that they aim to overcome the massive denial of war crimes implemented by the local politicians. They investigate the dilemma of ethnic identities as well as hybrid identities. So here I'm using this term that Viktoria said that she is more using the belonging, but yeah, I was just following Sasha Vojkovic and Stefano Bianchini, also Marco Pulleri. I saw he just released a book, and it's also about hybrid identity. So I'm using this term, hybrid or fluid identities. And then also these films raise the awareness about the unrecognized heroes that fought for the lives of other human beings, not necessarily of their own nation, right? And then these films also emphasize the gendered perspective of warfare and nationalism. And finally, some of the films give a very personal perspective of war crimes and its traumas. So what I also noticed that actually they really discuss relevant issues of today's post-Yugoslav society that are the aftermath of Yugoslav wars, unresolved questions of war crimes, ethnic tensions, ethnic as well as gender discrimination, PTSD, and finally broken families and relationships. And in contrast to that, the right-wing politicians continue to foster nationalistic ideas, focusing on the collective enemy as the other, concealing and eliminating the real problems in the economic sphere, as well as education, healthcare, unemployment, and of course, the topics of war past and traumas. Therefore, this research shows that alternative cinematography breaks through the cracks of hegemony as the contemporary filmmakers challenge narratives, impressions, and artificial problems constructed by the ruling elites. Also, it reveals that a sort of movement emerges as the new generation of filmmakers has this common motivation to disclose the truth about the war crimes, as well as unpack the war traumas and the distortions of memory and the recent past. So the transnational, non-nationalistic post-Yugoslav cinema continues the Yugoslav cinema tradition in the way that directors, producers, and actors from ex-Yugoslav space continue to cooperate to release high-grade films and break the silence, to accelerate the process of dealing with the legacy of painful experiences of the war, destruction, and hatred. Thus, cinema makers, with their political, public, and moral position, can play an important role as activist citizens. Activist citizen is actually a concept of Milija Radović that I don't think I have time to discuss, right? So I would just sum up everything what I just said. So in conclusion, the post-Yugoslav films may be employed in reconciliation and peacemaking processes as they appear as strongly anti-war films that give voices to the victims, discovering the unseen reality. The post-Yugoslav cinema, in contrast to the mainstream Hollywood production, may even assist societal and political developments in the divided ex-Yugoslav societies, because instead of dividing, it shows paths of social solidarity and empathy among people with an ambition to contribute lasting peace and stability in the region. So these are only a few references of my research. So Martin Lanier and his article on Rwanda's genocide, that is quite rare as he is exploring films from this perspective. Then Stephen Lux and his, the third dimension of power, and finally methodological nationalism. So thank you so much for your attention. And if you're interested in my topic or want to ask something, please contact me on my email. And actually just a bit of promotion that I'm now looking for a nice PhD program. So if you could help me with that or you have any offers, please let me know. Yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
We have to start again. Rimante, thank you very much. So we will think about your future PhD project, but I can't be sure if we will find one for you. Cécile and Anna, please.
Thank you so much. So we are the last presentation of the last panel, which is also the longest one with 4 presentations. Either you are completely falling asleep or you are completely waking up now. So, we will try not to make you sleep. So actually I have to change a little bit my hat because Oksana presented me or our project, Remembering the Past and the Conflicts of the Present. And this is another hat I'm wearing, which is actually a research project called Minsk as Perceived from Within. It's rather a practitioner research project, which we will now present to you. This Minsk process perceived from within, I would like to give you a little bit the background, the rationale, and Anna will then present more like some preliminary results of the research. The official negotiations for peace in eastern Ukraine, also called the Minsk process, are going on since 2014, we all know. And we also know these 2 pieces called Minsk agreements, consisting of the memorandum, which was signed in September 2014, and the package of measures, which actually signed in February 2015, organizing the implementation of the memorandum. They have this Minsk agreements, they have the official, like the political roof of the Normandy format, bringing together the heads of state from Germany, France, Russia, and Ukraine. But very importantly, of course, the Minsk process is implemented by the OSCE and the Trilateral Contact Group, which is a very important format because it brings together, it's actually the only format, official format, bringing together all the conflict parties, all the conflict sides. It's an inclusive format. So today, 6 years after the signing of the agreements, or of the first agreement, the implementation is still very challenging. The criticism goes in different directions. So first, there is a lack of efficiency. There is no political settlement. There is progress, but only like very punctual and small success. The second point is that the agreements are criticized because they were concluded under military pressure during a period of escalation and uneven power relations. They were, and that's the point where actually our research steps in, they were concluded, negotiated and signed behind closed doors without inclusion of society. And this paper and the research project behind it, so the Minsk process as perceived from within, this paper and the project are inspired by this non-inclusion of society and the resulting myths and fears linked with this Minsk process. The topic, the questions, the topic is born in the framework of the Women Initiatives for Peace in Donbass. All our co-authors, a few of whom I hope are following also the presentation online, or maybe. All of our authors are members of this dialogue network. It was created in 2016. And deals with burning questions of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, bringing together activists from Ukraine, including the non-controlled territories, Russia and Western Europe. So these Women Initiatives for Peace actually, were the framework in which the project was born. The research project itself is not only a research project, but it is a research dialogue, actually. It follows the line of the WIPD's philosophy of diapraxis, which links dialogue and praxis, so the practical cooperation. It is also a dialogue between researchers and practitioners. So we have people working in very different professional fields. And it brings together those different sides. So some of our researchers are from Ukraine, Russia, and Switzerland. We would thank to the Center for Culture and Governance in Europe for the generous support they provided to us, and we would thank the WIPD, the Women Initiatives for Peace, for the access actually they opened for us to have to our respondents, which is very important. It's very difficult to make interviews. So a few words about research methods and about our research and methods. So the aim of this study, Minsk as perceived from within, is to know more about what do people think, what do people know and what do people think about the Minsk process. People in the different territories concerned by the conflicts. So we made 144 interviews in all parts of Ukraine, of controlled parts of Ukraine, in the non-controlled parts of Ukraine, and in Russia. Whereas we divided always the parts close to the conflict zone and the parts more remote from the conflict zone. So because this have influences. There were also non-geographic groups of respondents, which means IDPs and refugees. So Donbas refugees in Russia, who, by the way, proved to be a very important channel for information for also the positions of the non-controlled territories, where often the positions were not communicated in a direct and open way, but in a hidden way. So, and the Donbass refugees in Russia proved to be a very important channel for information. So now I would like to hand over to Anna, who will give us a few snapshots of the results of preliminary.
Right, thank you, Cécile. Hi everyone. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? More. Okay.
7.
So I can energize everybody. Yes, okay, wonderful. All right. So as Cécile said, I will just make a quick reference back to the premise. So that our initial assumption was this: like, why do we want to tap into the societal perceptions? Not only because it's a fancy and cool thing to do, or it's the buzzword from the UN and anyone else to promote inclusivity, but to actually understand what is the potential for the sustainability of whatever peace agreement will come eventually, right? Because in our field, the assumption is that if you bring in the civil society, the voice of the society, not only civil society, but the society at large, into the peace agreement, that impacts their lives eventually. So that should make any peace agreement sustainable. So that was the assumption. And because what Cécile said already, that the Minsk agreements have been signed under military logic, excluded, like the society didn't even have a chance to have its say, because it had to be very quickly, right? The fire had to be extinguished on the ground. So the assumption is that, okay, there is a big gap. So let's just bridge this gap. So maybe the implementation challenges have to do with the fact that the people's voices are not in the agreement, right? So that was our premise and assumption. And interestingly enough, the preliminary finding, one of the preliminary findings shows that even if the voices were not included intentionally, the positions that we have been able to understand through the perceptions very much reflect the official positions on all sides. So that's one key interesting finding, preliminary. I have to stress on the preliminary, because I think for me personally, when we were going in, we were thinking that it's going to be very different, and it's going to help us then to go to the official people and say, there's a lot of opening here, you're not tapping into the people's voices, so tap into the people's voices. However, what we have come up with, sort of the framework for our analysis, we have been inspired by this whole Harvard model of negotiations, and one of the key principles being, separate positions from interest, right? And I can tell you quickly what that means on the example of our research. Basically, position is what you say you want, and the interest is sort of the need and the fear that is behind it. So we thought that it would be an interesting way of analyzing the data that we have gotten, basically looking at the positions of different people from different parts of Ukraine and Russia on the key provisions of the Minsk Agreement, and then tap into the interests and see whether, the positions, and then under the interest, do we have space for some sort of a mutual agreement, possibility to come up with an agreement and to actually do this, what we call mutually acceptable solution. So that has been the logic, that has been the approach. Quickly about the provision, so that we all know what we're talking about. The key provisions of the Minsk Agreement are like border control, which we are focusing on in this presentation. But then there's the political status of the armed formations, or the so-called LNR, DNR, the republics, the so-called republics. Then there's the amnesty issue of prisoner exchange, demilitarization, withdrawal of heavy weapons, demining, etc. So we are basically the framework that I just shared with you, tapping into the interest, teasing out the interest from the stated positions. We are looking today just at the border control. Our plan is to do the whole analysis for an upcoming publication by the OSCE Insights, which is an annual publication by Hamburg. I think it's called CORE Research Center. It's the OSCE Research Center at the University of Hamburg. So border control. What did we figure out? To be on the same page when we talk about border control, I mean, for those of you who know Ukraine, the conflict in and around Ukraine, we're talking about the state border between Russia and Ukraine, that I think about 450 kilometers, if not more. So still, I'm bad with numbers, but it's quite a huge chunk of border between Russia and Ukraine that is not anymore under Ukrainian control as a result of the conflict, war, whatever you want to call it, but it's under Russian control. So for Ukraine, this is a key issue also at the negotiating table, that there is no political status for whatever shape and form for the so-called LNR-DNR until Ukraine as a state gains control over its own state border, right? So this is the big dilemma, and actually this is the looming dilemma that is hampering progress on the Minsk talks, right? Now, the border control is not talked about directly at the negotiation table, but it's always there. Now, what do people think about this? It was interesting, I mean, for the sake of simplicity right now, I mean, we have, but also to try to make it easier, which might not do justice to the whole range of perceptions, but we have come up with two key clusters of perceptions or positions, and one is border first, and I'll explain in a second, and the other one is status first, and then we have a more nuanced, or what you call it, moderate cluster, which is like statehood first. So let me get into the border first. Basically, you have, I'm not going to say from which regions, and I don't want to do that unless you are interested, and then we can take it up in the discussion. But basically, the cluster border first is very understandable. I mean, it's okay. Border first are they think that, okay, there is no political settlement of this conflict unless Ukraine takes over full control over the border. That's their position. The status first is there is no border control. The Ukraine cannot have control over the border because the political settlement has to come first. That's the status first, right? Now I will leave the state to the side, and I'll focus on this one in my last minute and a half you can give me, right? So these are the positions, and then what we saw that seemingly incompatible positions can actually, when we come on the interest level, it's not as incompatible as it seems. And what do we mean by this? So basically, why does Ukraine want control over its border? Because of the need of security. It's very simple. You need to have your security. It's a symbolism of your national, not symbolism actually, an important attribute of your statehood, etc. But at the core of it, the fear is security. You want to be secure. You want to have control over your own territory, territorial integrity, etc. But the status first people, those people who wanted status first, their fear was also security because they were afraid of isolation. You know, if they don't have border, controlled part is closed, they're choking, so they're afraid of isolation. But they also need security there because they're afraid if the Ukraine takes over the border with Russia, it will be remilitarized, then there will be attack, etc., etc. So at the core of it is security. Again, I'm simplifying. This is not doing justice to the whole work, 1 minute, but like work for everybody else. So this is where we see an opening. This is where we see how possibly we can come up with recommendations for the official people, but also for all the work that needs to be done in the society in connection to what Oksana said. I think it's, the narratives and the myths that are out there, meaning making, etc. It's all connected. Now, one thing I wanted to say, what we also you should take it with a grain of salt. I mean, I at least take it with a grain of salt because there's lack of communication from the officials on these issues for the people to be well informed, and there's lack of conceptual clarity also for all of this. So that also causes a lot of the myth and the negative narratives that people might have about one or two provision. I'm going to stop with that. I hope you have interesting questions and we can provide some answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we will listen to comments from Oleksandra Tarkhanova. You can. Sorry, it's like you also need to sit here. Answer to your comments later.
I will sit here because there is a camera. Here.
I'm sorry for this. It was a strange game.
I will start and I will time myself not to. No. I know that we are on a short time frame, so I will try not to go on and on about the
papers, what I read in the papers, but get straight to the questions rather. First of all, I wanted to really thank all the authors for sharing their papers with me. It was really fascinating to read all four papers. So one of the papers I got a little bit later, that's why it will stand out slightly, but I think it's also a very different paper, yours. So all papers of these three first papers address the topic of the panel in its own way. So they namely look at how societies in the region deal with the ongoing conflict or with the aftermath of the conflict, particularly how they reimagine, rearticulate, and reapply historical narratives, either of the conflict itself or narratives that ascribe and define positions within the conflict. And so these processes always take place within a contested field of power relations. So dominant narratives on the interpretation of the past clash with positional interpretations, and actors in power try to exclude or silence anyone challenging the temporally dominant position. So I think my questions to all papers touch on this issue, and specifically touch on the methodological aspect of studying this tension between different historical narratives, one of which enjoys the hegemonic position at a particular time. So the first paper of Oksana, I really like the paper very much, and I think it, as we talked about it, for now has two different parts in a written form. I think in that presentation you offered us a lot of empirical material that meets your theoretical material. So the first part of the paper is very theoretical very theoretical writing, and only in the presentation you gave some empirical support to it, which I really appreciate. And but I think my first question to you was exactly to prompt you to connect the theoretical and the empirical parts. You did that, but now I think that the empirical part in the paper, specifically the one on the mnemonic politics on the ground, is left a little bit forgotten, or you didn't get to it in the presentation, and I didn't catch the connection between the theory and this part of your empirical material. I didn't get that. So my question was how the transformative power of violence to bring certain marginal political actors to the forefront especially affects local mnemonic politics versus, let's say, educational politics. Is there something special that happens between certain marginal radical political actors coming to power and the politics of memory? Besides that, coming to the point that I made before in relation to all the papers, I was wondering, how do you understand dominance of certain perceptions or of certain actors? How do they become dominant? Is the dominant perception the one that wins, so to say, a particular situated political struggle that you describe in great fascinating detail? Is it then perhaps a reflection of a political window of opportunity in the context of Ukraine during war? So transformative power of violence, is that where the connection comes in? Or are we talking about more complex establishment of new dominant, one might say hegemonic political discourse? Moving on to the second paper by Viktoria, again, I read the Ukrainian version, and it's really fascinating. And as you said, the empirical material is so rich, and anybody who can should read that version. You make a very strong case for using the concept of belonging, I think, and I had no doubt that it works as you want it to work in relation to your topic. You conclude that for the most part, IDPs belong or construct their belonging by choice, rather than through exclusion and othering. And I don't think you touched upon that as much in your presentation, but I think that's where my question lies. So a part of your paper deals with tolerance and acceptance of the Ukrainian society, and more specifically where IDPs land on the scale of inclusion-exclusion, to what extent they are or might be othered. And the results of this survey show that Ukrainians generally exhibit a high level of tolerance and acceptance of most groups, including IDPs, from Donbas and from Crimea. So I was wondering if how would you relate the results of this survey to the result of some other academic articles and research that shows that on a discursive level, on the political discursive level, the Ukrainian society becomes less tolerant. It becomes more rigid, and the opposition between us and them becomes so instrumental for a society in crisis, in conflict. So would you agree that there is a disparity between what surveys of the population's attitudes show and how the subject of IDP is constructed in policies and in politics? And kind of in relation to that, why I asked this question is because I was wondering who is the audience of actors in your research when they build and articulate their belonging. Who are they talking to? And I was particularly wondering, to what extent would you say that the strategies that they employ to articulate their belonging are devised in response to the hegemonic political discourse on IDP? So they're not only talking to their neighbors where they relocate, for example, but maybe they talk to what they see on TV and what they hear political actors say in printed media. Looking for the ground on which they can articulate this belonging, many of your participants land on belonging to a particular class, right? So you talk about the urban professional milieu with which specifically IDPs from Donbass associate themselves. And I was just wondering, would this be different if the participants in your research would not come from big cities or would not belong to the class of professionals? So what would you say to that? Yes, and now moving on to the next paper, Rimante. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. I Googled all the movies you wrote about and watched the trailers because I'm completely new to this topic. You, unlike Victoria's paper, you very explicitly position these directors who make these movies in a position to the political elite in the region. You say that they produce atypical, challenging narratives to the hegemonic constructions, or maybe even to the hegemonic silences. At the same time, you write that they're not funded by external organizations or external actors, and therefore they do not rely on Western narratives of reconciliation and peace building brought into the region from outside. So that's why I wonder where these alternative interpretations, or maybe rather re-articulations of war traumas and crimes that shine the light on human, collective, universal experiences, where do they come from? What would you say? And you, in your presentation, which was not in the paper, you did say that these movies break through the I cannot read my own writing, but they break through the walls of hegemony. Let's put it that way. So then I wonder, how do these new alternative perspectives gain legitimacy in national and nationalist environments that you describe as quite hostile? So they do not need to be hegemonic in order to gain legitimacy to do those cracks in the hegemonic regime, in my perspective. So I was wondering, or maybe if in your perspective, maybe they are not legitimate at all, and then they completely belong in the sphere of Western festivals, let's put it that way. And now moving on to the last paper. So this paper deals with the question of peace building in the most explicit way among all the other papers. I think I had some, I'm not gonna rehash the findings, which I found absolutely fascinating, and I really loved that you focused on one aspect of Minsk, specifically the border control. It really gives a lot of concrete information on a very broad topic of Minsk agreement, I think. I think the first comment was that I would like to prompt you to give us give us examples, or rather just walk us through the process of how this dialogue between representatives and between people coming from these very different regions involved in this conflict, how did these dialogues go about? Especially I found fascinating that Ukrainians from non-conflict areas from further away and Russians from further away regions seem to express similar opinions on the issue of the border. So I would love to hear more about it. I think in the paper I didn't get this differentiation between position and interest as much as in the presentation, and I think that really helps. And it already gives me the answer to my next question, but I think would like to ask it, and it's rather a naive question. I wonder if you see a realistic resolution to the conflict of sequencing, as you put it, the statehood/border first or status first. And I felt like there was one sentence in the paper that drew our attention to the fact that the line of contact as such should also be negotiated or should be opened up. And potentially this is, as you said, your way in, the light and the end of the tunnel. Would you say that that is a way to realistically resolve this? Or I was wondering what your ideas are on this. Thank you.
Oleksandra, thank you so much for your comments. Oksana, please.
I will be brief.
Yeah, very.
Thank you so much, Oleksandra. Very helpful and very close reading. Really made an effort to read and to think about our papers. I fully agree on your comment. Like in the next step, I plan to turn this into 2 papers. Actually, one is on violence and one on memory. And this is just a reflection of my lockdown reading literature, where I started with one theoretical lens, like traditional memory, and then I saw that I'm not advancing with this lens, and then I developed this new by drawing different literatures. So that's, I will now attach my empirics to my old theory, and then this will be attached to my new theory. And then for dominant narratives, I use the example as this dominant interpretation as fighters for freedom of Ukraine, how it has been advanced at the local level as a dominant interpretation of death in the military conflict. That's of course this reflection of already built-in interpretative frameworks which exist, where the cult of heroes is very much established, and it's very easy to add a new layer, new interpretation to the existing very profound existing interpretations. But what I found very interesting, it's also the role of local institutions, as for example, libraries, local self-governed bodies, which find kind of merger of different narratives, where for them the cult of heroes, as for nationalist parties, there are only one type of heroes, like fighters, OUN, UPA, Streltsy, but for local authorities, they put heroes like there are Soviet soldiers, Streltsy, UPA, like all of these people who are fighting for Ukrainian independence, and you see there is kind of inclusion, but using as a dominant narrative the cult of heroes. So that's, I think there are kind of this dominant narrative is the way how it's established. It's by using this very already profound established cultural understanding by adding new dimensions. And also there is a contestation. That's another issue, how the contestation of this dominant narrative is desecration and all of this, but I think it's a separate issue, but there is always also contestation to this dominant narrative.
Thank you, Oksana. You can stay here. Victoria, would you like to reply?
You have to unmute, Victoria.
But it's Oleksandra.
Yeah, both sides. So thank you for your questions. Of course, with the shortage of time, you don't have a possibility to articulate all topics. First of all, the audiences. Methodologically, we try to employ it in many places people who were local or who were IDPs themselves. So when conducting interviews, not to create any additional oppositions or any additional group identities which with which our respondents should feel framed, within which they would feel framework, or with which they would be in a debate or discussion. Of course, the major methodological bias might be that in majority of cases, even when we were conducting, or our interviewers were conducting interviews on Ukrainian non-controlled territories, we still probably have more respondents with, I would say, pro-Ukrainian views, or at least willing to express more pro-Ukrainian views than those with different types of views. And especially problematic region for us is Crimea, because despite in several projects we aimed to conduct interviews there, but people were too afraid and refused to talk to the interviewers, which says that probably there are also certain views and opinions which are not encountered, but at least what we have, this is what we have, and in our collection we have already more than 5 projects, and 2 of them included non-government controlled territories, which gives us certain positions and certain views. Your question about the, again, this hegemonic discourse and where we have less tolerant attitudes towards the IDPs. Yes, if you look at the media discourse or political discourse, and in many cases, those of us who worked with experts and expert communities working with IDPs, quite often we're talking about certain biases and practices of othering, but we deliberately asked these questions: how people feel on the territories, what are the major cases of exclusions, are these cultural cases of exclusion, or some other economical cases of exclusion. So majority, if we are talking about the practices of othering and exclusions, this would be more economical. So there would be some difficulties for people to find the places for live, to rent places, and also when they are looking for jobs. But in this, the other elements of the cultural inclusion is much more strong in Ukraine. And this, one of the reasons, I guess, again, why our IDPs from Donbas group is referring more to the urban identities and more to professional identities, not to push themselves into much more contested and narrow types of belonging or identities based on ethnicity or region. I guess this is the also additional strategy to step beyond what is contested, and to use those grounds where they have a common experiences with such big industrial cities as Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Dnipropetrovsk, even in this case would be Kyiv or Lviv. And we also, Donbas is a heavily industrialized region. So if you look in pre-conflict situation, 90% of population live in the cities. So this is not that we were conducting interviews only with those who live in the cities, and that's why they want to live in the city. And in our studies, which we're conducting about Donbas beginning 1994, we constantly had the same story when local, urban and professional identities were quite often much more important for people than national or regional. So this is not a recent story, and this is elements of belonging of which are used by the IDPs from Donbas to quite easily and smoothly build into the receiving societies. As of tolerance, again, the question is what we measure. Of course, if we study political discourse or media discourse, we will probably have, especially during endless political campaigns in Ukraine, we would have a lot of intolerance present. But if we are looking at people's attitudes towards identities, towards ethnic identities, toward different elements of culture, such as language, religion, and so on, this is not only results of our study, St.Gallen study about regionalism without regions, but also if you look at the case study, which is with a specific focus on Donbass, and some other prominent sociological agencies in Ukraine, they would say mostly the same, that tolerance at the everyday level is much higher than what we see from media reports. And people themselves relate to this, because quite often during the interviews, they would say that we do not support what's said on TV, we do not support government, but we feel very much part of the society if we are talking about the society which they are relate themselves to. I don't know if I answered all your questions, but this is more or less.
Yeah, yes, thank you so much. Rimante, would you like to answer?
Yeah, I can try a little bit. Thank you so much, Oleksandra. Thanks a lot for a feedback. I'm still trying to digest, because everything just went so fast that I kind of got lost in all these questions. But yeah, I mean, these terms, they are definitely challenging all these great narratives constructed by Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian states. And I mean, some of the films, for example, Grbavica by Jasmila Zbanic, it even managed actually to change the law of the Bosnian law towards the raped woman after the war. And also, yeah, I mean, they reveal really the topics that are uncomfortable for the politicians. So sometimes they even have screenings like outside the city to just avoid, you know, this demonstrations of right-wingers or something like that. Especially the ones who reveal the war crimes topic, not, let's say, the individual stories. But what's interesting that even, you know, the family stories, the stories about relationships, they are really like accepted as very politicized, even though they were not, you know. For example, one film was really about just one family who basically broke up after the war. And this is what the director wanted to say, like he revealed the story of his family, just saying that what happened to his family, but what was it accepted by some viewers, like there were some reviews that some people thought that his father, you know, was a war-like criminal, even though, I mean, he was enrolled in the war, but that doesn't mean that, you know, he became a war criminal automatically. So I think what is very, how to say, very visible in the Balkans, that the history and all this memory is so politicized as I think never before. And well, you also mentioned funding. So if I could just comment on funding. So actually the funding comes from National Film Center, if the country has one. So like Croatia is actually following the EU, like as all the film centers in European Union. So it's independent from the ministry. Yeah, and then Serbian Film Center is also trying to follow that path, but though they have some problems actually. At some point, sometimes it's more, let's say, free to make decisions, and sometimes less, depends on who is in charge of the center. And for example, Bosnia doesn't really have a film center, as it has 2 entities. Yeah, so yeah, I don't think I answered to your questions, though I tried. But yeah, I found it quite challenging. So if you could just email me these questions, I would be grateful so I could think about it more. Yeah.
Thank you, Rimante. And finally, Anna and Cécile, would you like to respond?
Well, actually, I wrote 3 questions, not 2 questions. It's about dialogue, which is about the framework, the methodological framework, and the second one about conversion of the far away regions, and this third one about the line of contact to be opened up. I would like to focus on the second one for the sake of concentration. The other we can also bilaterally discuss. So the second one about like this conversion of the far away regions, Russia and Ukraine. In Russia and Ukraine, basically this is the provision or the position of border first. So a border must be the restoration of the control of a border must be reestablished before we discuss about like anything else. And the interesting thing is that these two areas remote from the conflict, they often have also in Russia very like this national, a more abstract understanding of statehood, more like national interest as like also national pride or national, like this political statehood. And I would like to contrast this with the other regions which are more close to the conflict areas, which are actually also on Russia, the border zone on the Russian side, and the gray zone in the controlled Ukrainian territories. They have a much more pragmatic approach to this question of border, very much in line also what Oksana said. I think it's the transformative power of violence. So actually they went through this conflict and they have it experienced on their own skin, and they have a different approach. They first want security and statehood. So statehood in a sense of like reconstruction of infrastructure, etc., etc. So this is a different understanding of statehood. Maybe also we should a bit discuss and deconstruct and then reconstruct, if I understood Boris correctly, the meaning of statehood, what it means. It's not only this abstract national security and national pride, but it's also this concrete functioning of statehood on the ground, like light during the night, transport, pensions, etc. Which question? Or do you,
that doesn't matter. I can quickly say about dialogue, how it came together, or the sequencing, whatever. Let me do the sequencing. That's my bread and butter too. I mean, look, I would leave the line of contact aside, and I would not dare ask at this point to say that we have a solution. Absolutely not. Otherwise, the paper would have been published, right? So we do not have the recommendation yet. But we're really hoping to, but basically by tapping into the interest area, to show that it's not so much the sequencing that is the challenge, but rather the political will and the military will to do so, if you will. Huh? So this is just my meta message here for us, because if there is that political will and military will on the track one, on the official negotiations, then they would be very open to see this space that we're hoping to create by tapping into the interest. But at the moment, the way it is a big issue, not only on border control, but pretty much first, or do we do security settlement first? So it's very clear that right now they're at loggerheads for that. In terms of the dialogue, do you want me to ask this? I mean, your question was, how did we do this? And the whole idea was that, you know, my God, 6 years ago, almost, when we started thinking about this project, the initiative, I would say, we were thinking, okay, we bring women together from as representative as possible of Ukraine and Russia, which is, you know, far from being ideal, but we are one of the first to try to talk to all sides, create a safe platform where people, you know, from across the conflict cleavage can talk to each other. But we purposefully decided not to discuss the causes of the conflict, but because, you know, it was going to go nowhere, right? It was going to be just a talking show. We decided that it would be great to introduce what Cécile referred to in the beginning, this methodology of diapraxis. Let's work on problems of practical importance that were actually a result of the conflict, not the cause, because this is what we can do as a group, and cooperate together. By cooperating together, by doing what we call mini initiatives on issues like, you know, integration of ex-combatants, media analysis, what do I know, all kinds of different, you know, exchange between Donetsk and Lviv on coffee culture and all kinds of stuff. By doing this, there was a lot of trust built throughout the 5 years, so that then we can talk about the touchy and sensitive issues. Huh? And the research now goes into the touchy and sensitive issues, but within our mini group, there is enough trust among all of us to to actually look at the sensitive issues and discuss it and actually agree on the text that will go into the public. So I don't know if that answers your question. Yes.
Can I just add to the second question about the
very brief,
contact? Yeah, very brief. So basically, this is a deadlock of the, again, it's a deadlock due to the interest of security, because the non-controlled territories, they feel themselves squeezed between the border. By the way, also coronavirus, it was closed border with Russia, and the contact line with Ukraine, it was also coronavirus closed. So they are actually now it's a little bit like an exercise of borders for them with this corona crisis. And the interest of like the contact line to be opened up is exactly the reintegration into the Ukrainian state in a full way, not as something something that is sealed off from Russia and sealed off from Ukraine. It's a security interest for them to be able to also, escape, to move, to be mobile. It's an interest, an economic interest and a security interest that they can move. It's a mobility interest, like in case of attack or whatever.
Thank you, Cécile. Now I open our Q&A section and I see the first question, Sandra, then Raul. So yeah, please state your name and your date of birth.
My question goes to Rimante and say hi to Anna, because she was just here at the workshop in January. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yeah, I must.
I'm not sure if she can hear me. Can you hear me?
Renate?
Yeah, I can hear you, sorry.
So my
they are not looking, to the camera, so I'm kind of still.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, you are using the transnational lens for your thesis. And so Glickschiller says that states, of course, are embedded in cultural practices that go beyond the nation state. And of course, it's like the Yugoslav sphere, so the post-Yugoslav sphere. But I was wondering if you're actually going beyond that even. Because what is it, the Magnificent Century, right? So we can connect back to the Ottoman Empire, for instance. Connected to that question, I was wondering, instead of using film, you could have also used pink, because we all know, right, it's the pink nation that connects the post-Yugoslav sort of sphere. That could have been sort of another avenue by which to look at this common cultural, also to use that term, memory in the post-Yugoslav sphere. And I was wondering if you're doing anything in that direction. Then I was wondering if I did understand you correctly, that you said movies do, in this sense, not serve the manipulative sort of purpose, but in a way that contradicts the pre-war reality, by which we all know that Tito was a great lover of movies, and he used the fourth power very, very strongly to actually create a common Yugoslav identity, right? So this is a sort of a contradiction, and I was wondering if you're dealing with that in your work too. And the last thing I want to ask is that, how do you react to people saying they're tired of war movies? Because we've watched them now for 25 years, and this is sort of something that is vanishing a little bit, and I was wondering how you're dealing with that in your thesis. Thank you.
Wow, that's many questions. So I will, first of all, yeah, the Yugosphere, I'm not sure whether I went up the Yugosphere. Well, I'm actually coming myself from the Lithuania. So if I, also studying in Bologna, so if I could say that, that I've heard I'm coming from a bit different background. But okay, that's also socialist background, and I'm studying in Bologna. So I mean, I got some insights from like different professors. So, but yeah, I'm still not sure. I would say, yeah, probably in this case, I went through these borders, you know, of Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, and everything, but not above the Yugosphere. I guess so. Yeah, I would have to think of something else, something more. Maybe just look, yeah, at the European. European Union, for example, and the funds of if that, but yeah, that's a good question. I guess no, I didn't overcome the Yugosphere. Then going to the veteran films, well, I could say that yeah, I've heard this like from younger people that they are tired of war films and so on, and the films that I explore are actually very anti-war films, and they don't even show the war itself usually. I mean, they kind of address more the aftermath of the war and how the people deal with it, not showing, you know, there is no films of Kusturica in my research where everything is burning or pretty village, pretty flames. So no, I don't really deal with these films. But for example, again, I have a director, Dirlevic, who there was his film Men Don't Cry. So actually that he's a war veteran and he's creating a film himself. So for example, Pavle Levy was actually writing about veteran films, the veteran films that emerged in the 90s, who like veterans themselves would create some films that would be usually, well, quite funny and not so good quality. So, but Dirlevic here shows like he's a war veteran, but what he shows that his being as a war veteran is something I think very interesting perspective, because he takes not this perspective of like taking one side of another, but he basically takes all sides, but above all he takes the human side. In his film he takes these men from different ex-republics who fought on the different sides. And he also tries to, you know, kind of go into what actually this man felt and how they are feeling afterwards, having PTSD, broken families, and so on. Yeah, right. So, and what was the last question? Yeah, the veteran. Okay. So about Tito. So no, I didn't really have anything. I didn't have any comparison back to partisan films or anything like that. But yeah, that would be very interesting. And I agree that, well, I didn't really find these films. I mean, I understand that cinema as a medium, like when you read McLuhan and everything, and or also I read like Blaker from Australia. So of course, like media, it shapes. I mean, it basically shapes opinion. It shapes what we think. Like if we also take the Hollywood cinema and what happened after terrorist attacks, how the identity of Muslims are shaped, I think it's so like visible actually what's happening. Then some kind of like approaches and images are presented in the media, like how it affects the people. But here actually I believe that these directors and then I talked to them, I don't really think that they wanted, you know, to kind of have some negative impact or to manipulate the viewer. So I would say that, yeah, these films, according to me, are more from the perspective of, you know, just understanding what happened in the 90s, and yeah, and towards some just like talking about these issues, and then starting from scratches, because politicians are always looking back for the past but not really solving anything, so they don't really want to do anything more, while these filmmakers just want to reveal all this, the truth about the war crimes, the crimes, I mean, for the humanity, and they want to, you know, their people to move on. yeah, so I hope I answered.
Thank you. Raul, you have only one short question.
I can also skip it.
No, if you want, we still have 3 minutes.
I'll be the last one in the chair, I guess. Well, I have short questions, but I have fear. Oksana, thank you. I mean, first of all, thank you very much. This was a great panel. I really enjoyed all the presentations. And Oksana, quick question. What are the differences in terms of conceptualizing memory between Svoboda and the Bratstvo or UPA? I mean, there are 2 different groups, so I suppose there are some differences between them. What are these? Victoria, you were mentioning othering, and the main marker of othering as being something, the affiliation with Bandera or UPA, but I didn't quite understand what you meant there. I also didn't quite understand, yeah, just clarify that. And Rimante, I enjoyed this. My question to you would be, you say this post-Yugoslav cinema breaks through the cracks of hegemony, but I tend to see hegemony as more subtle and more pervasive than just political statements and political stances. So rather than breaking through the cracks of hegemony, wouldn't you ask instead rather whose hegemony is this reflecting? Because if you say common humanity, universal values, and so on, this sounds very hegemonic to me. It sounds very much like, you know, liberal hegemony all the way. So it might be non-hegemonic in the Yugoslav strict sense of Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian, but everything you told us sounds to me very hegemonic. Just another hegemonic. Thanks.
So, dear participants, very briefly.
Yeah. I was asked such a long question, very difficult to answer briefly.
Try to.
I would say what they have in common, it is rejection of the Soviet past and belief that there is Ukrainian history, which is non-Soviet history. And very clearly they construct both of them, the history narrative as Ukrainian history with a line which is starting with Kievska Rus, Cossack statehood, UNR, ZUNR, and then OUN-UPA struggle, and then current ATO struggle. Very clear line, and Soviet history is considered as the time of occupation, fully excluded from this historical narrative, and the whole struggle is just to whatever they construct, like I have shown just a selection, but they have just glued the entire city, small city, with what they consider our monuments, our plagues, and this is just non-Soviet interpretation of history. Whatever is linked to kind of the history of Ukrainian statehood, which is non-Soviet statehood. Then there are differences, and we can discuss this over dinner, but there are organizational differences, like the groups which we belong to and the way they act, but I don't see difference in historical interpretation.
So,
Maria?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Okay, very briefly, as I discussed and try to show that this attitudes toward the Soviet past, and especially Second World War, became what we see temporarily is the key moment, a key historical marker around which this new sense of belonging develops. And of course, from previous conferences and our discussions, we know that part of this important element of the Second World War myth is the myth, Soviet myth of the Great Patriotic War on the one side, and the myth of Ukrainian insurgent army and Bandera on the other side, which are part of what, again, Oksana just showed us, this a big debate within the Ukrainian society. And here we, again, within the narratives of our IDPs, we see that these are the key points, tension points. Some of them are claiming that they are having debates within their family narratives, and they are now changing their views about, for example, Bandera or Ukrainian interpretation of the Second World War, trying to build into the local societies. On the other side, we also have a situation when Bandera, as the most negative or Ukrainian UPA, are used as a labels which are applied either to anybody who has pro-Ukrainian views, even if these views are not right-wing or nationalistic. Or in certain cases, what we see, this label is applied toward all Ukrainian society. So those banderids, these are banderas, and in this case, the bandera figure or the situation, the myth, negative or positive around him, creates the key element of othering. And what is very, for me, problematic, when the whole society, for the whole society, certain historical labels are used, and then we already have double trench. We not only have Ukrainian government-controlled society versus non-government control, but we also have the Second World War memory war trench, where everybody in Ukraine is viewed as followers of Bandera, the whole Ukrainian society, for example, and anybody who is associated with that territory or with pro-Ukrainian views might be othered or even might risk their health and life because of this labeling. So I was just looking for those historical elements and figures which might create the key tensions and might be the most problematic. And in this case, we see that Bandera creates this point of tension.
Rimante, please briefly.
Okay, so actually I didn't really think about it, but now that I think about it, I mean, it makes sense. So I think at this stage I can just accept the criticism and think about it a bit more. Yeah, thanks.
So, thank you very much, and we wish you all success in all your projects, and there's